His boots hit the cold ground before dawn. The barn door creaked, not from wind this time, but his own unsteady hand. Thomas Halver paused at the threshold, pulse thumping harder than it should. He didn't know what he expected. Some illusion, maybe, sleep still clinging to his mind. But as the first light cracked over the ridge, painting the barn in soft blue and grey, he saw her. The figure hadn't moved much since last night, but now details came into view. Her dress was patched but neat, too clean for someone living rough. Her shoes were worn through, but the way she curled them under her body looked practiced, like she was used to sleeping without comfort. And her face, though tucked half beneath a mop of dark, tangled hair, bore features he hadn't seen in 2 decades. A line to her chin, the arch of her brow, the shape of her lips, God help him. They looked like Emma's, his late wife's. Family always said the girls resembled her more than him, but there had been something in their eyes, something Thomas recognized as his own. This girl's eyes weren't visible yet, but his heart had already gone somewhere dangerous. She stirred, not much, just a twitch in her shoulders and a mumble beneath her breath, but it made him step back, throat tightening. He should have called for the sheriff, or at least roused old Bill Carter down the road to come take a look with him, but Thomas didn't want her gone. Not yet. Not before he had answers. Not before he knew who she was. The girl blinked awake slowly, as if surfacing from some deep place. When she sat up, her eyes met his and widened with alarm. She scrambled back, bumping into a haystack, hands lifted halfway between defense and confusion. "Easy," Thomas said, his voice hoarse from disuse and disbelief. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't speak. Her breathing was rapid, but her eyes never left him. "You slept in my barn," he continued, quieter now. "You hungry?" Still, she said nothing. But the way her shoulders sagged, the way she didn't run, it was enough of a yes. Inside the house, Thomas moved like a man in a dream. Coffee boiled over once because he forgot he'd set it on. He burnt the edges of the cornbread. None of it mattered. When he brought the plate out, she was sitting on the barn's edge, legs dangling over, her expression unreadable. She watched every move he made as if calculating his steps. He set the plate down and stepped back, not sitting until she'd taken the first bite. It was cautious, a tiny nibble like a wild thing testing a snare. But once it hit her tongue, the dam broke. She devoured the food with quiet ferocity, eyes wet but unblinking. He didn't ask anything. Not yet. She looked like she'd bolt if he did. But something about her movements stirred memories, little mannerisms. The way she wiped her hands, on her dress, left over right. The habit of tapping her thumb against her plate like she was counting seconds. They were small things, but they cracked him open. "I had twin girls once," he said softly. "Long time ago." She paused but didn't look up. "Went missing during a river flood. Folks say they drowned. The wind moved between them. Her fork slowed, but their bodies were never found. No graves." Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were hazel. Familiar. "What's your name?" he asked, voice trembling now. A long pause. Then, "I don't know." 3 words, enough to unravel him. It wasn't just the sound of her voice. It was the cadence, like a note struck after 20 years of silence. He swallowed. "Do you remember anything?" She shook her head slowly, then added, "Dreams, maybe. Water, a cabin, a man shouting." Thomas's breath hitched. The flood had taken their cabin first, before sweeping down toward the cattle fields. He remembered the shouting too, his own, as he tore through the rising current. He stood slowly, fearing the moment might vanish if he moved too fast. "You don't remember your sister?" he asked. She blinked. A shadow passed across her face. "There was another," she whispered. "Sometimes I see her in dreams." He took a slow breath. "Do you remember her name?" The girl's face twisted. No. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. He let her finish her food. let her warm up inside the barn near the stove he lit for her. She flinched when the flames sparked, but calmed again quickly. Every movement seemed like instinct dulled by time and fear. By late afternoon, Thomas had told no one. He wasn't ready. Maybe he'd lost his mind. Maybe grief had hollowed him out so thoroughly that now he was filling the hole with a stranger's face. But when she fell asleep again on the cot he'd dragged from the attic, he sat beside her and watched the way her hands curled near her chin. He'd seen that posture before, in cribs, on the rug by the fire. It was the way Lila used to sleep. He didn't tell her the name, not yet. But he whispered it once anyway, just to see how it sounded. Lila. She didn't stir, but a tear rolled down her cheek. The next day, Thomas drove to the old county hall and retrieved a box he hadn't opened in 2 decades. Inside were photos, a broken rattle, and a locket that had belonged to Lila. He showed her none of it, but he kept it close, his fingers brushing over the silver shell like a prayer. When he returned to the barn, the cot was empty. Panic exploded in him, but the door hadn't been forced. There were no signs of struggle, just a note scrawled in uneven hand. "Thank you. I'm sorry." Thomas's hands shook as he read it again and again, but beneath the note, something shimmered. The locket, not the one from the box. A second one, twin. The wind was cutting sharp by the time Thomas stepped outside again. Snow flurries spiraled around the porch, and in the distance, the mountains blurred into a pale smudge, swallowed by the rising storm. But none of that chilled him more than the note still trembling in his fingers, or the second locket now resting in his palm, identical in shape and pattern to the one in the attic box. He turned it over slowly, fingers stiff, breath shallow. The back was etched with initials so faint he had to squint. C.H. He didn't move for a long time, just stood there under the awning, staring out at the empty field beyond the barn, where her footprints led into the snow, already half filled. He should have chased after her, should have done something, called someone. But a knot had formed in his gut, the kind of knot you feel before a storm, deep and unsettled. She hadn't run out of fear. Not exactly. She'd left something behind on purpose. A clue, or a message, maybe both. Back inside, Thomas lit the fireplace and unboxed the past again. The locket he'd saved was buried beneath baby shoes and Emma's handwriting in a worn journal. LH was etched faintly on its back. Lila Halver. He held the 2 side by side, mirror images, different wear, different scuffs, but unmistakably a match set. His girls had worn these. Every birthday picture showed them dangling around their small necks, 2 tiny hearts glinting beneath sunbonnets. He sat there until dusk, the fire burning low. The girl hadn't taken any food or blanket, no coat. She'd vanished into a mountain, snowstorm, with little more than her name hidden somewhere inside her. Thomas wrapped himself in his coat, slipped the 2 lockets into his breast pocket, and stepped back into the cold. He didn't tell Sheriff Bell. Bell was a good man, but Thomas didn't want questions he couldn't answer, not yet. Instead, he drove his mule cart down into Ashridge Hollow, where the old Black Creek line ran quiet now, disused since the mining days ended. It was the last direction her footprints pointed. Through ice and dry brush, he followed the trail until it vanished beyond a creek where the bridge had long since rotted through. From there, instinct had to take over. Every so often, he'd spot a sign, a thread of blue yarn caught on a bush, a heel print frozen into the crusted snow. And then, miles from home, when the sky was darkening and the stars began blinking out one by one under the storm clouds, he found her. She was huddled beneath an overhang of rock, wrapped in her arms, knees drawn up to her chest. A threadbare scarf lay over her shoulders, his scarf, the one he'd left by the barn stove years ago. Her breath came out in white plumes, shallow and shivering. "You left this," Thomas said, kneeling beside her. She didn't look up, but when he gently placed the twin locket in her hand, she stared down at it for a long time. Her fingers moved, slowly over the pattern. Then she whispered, "Where did you get it?" "It belonged to my daughter, Lila. You were wearing hers." The girl looked up now, confusion warping her face. "But that's not my name." Thomas's heart lurched. "Do you know your name?" She hesitated, then said quietly, "Clara." He let out a breath that nearly buckled him. "Clara." Emma's handwriting came flooding back. Lila and Clara. My perfect girls. The initials in the second locket. CH. "You remember that?" he asked, barely managing the words. She shook her head. "No. Someone called me that a long time ago. I thought it was a dream. It wasn't." Thomas knew it now, bone deep. The timing, the age, the face. Too much to be coincidence. "Where have you been?" he asked, voice trembling. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "With a woman. Since I was small. She said she found me by the river after a flood. Took me in. We moved a lot. Names changed. I never went to school. Never met anyone. She said the world was too dangerous. Said I had no family." Thomas swallowed hard. "Where is she now?" Clara looked down. "Gone. She passed 3 winters ago. I stayed in her cabin until the roof collapsed. Then I wandered." Thomas didn't press. He knew too well the kind of silence pain could breed. Instead, he laid his coat over her shoulders and offered a hand. She hesitated again, eyes flicking over his face with wary recognition, then reached out. Their hands met, smaller in his, but not as small as they once were. Time had stretched them apart, but not broken them. He brought her home. That night, Clara bathed, changed into Emma's old nightdress, and sat by the fire in silence while Thomas cooked. When he brought her a plate, she looked up and whispered, "Why didn't you come for me?" It shattered him. "I did," he said. "I searched the riverbanks for weeks, hired every tracker I could. They found the broken crib, your sister's bonnet. The sheriff said it was the flood, that no child could survive. But I did," he nodded slowly, "and I failed to find you." She didn't say more, just stared into the fire. Later, after she'd fallen asleep on the couch, Thomas sat with her locket in his hand, turning it over and over. The initials, the weight, the way it clinked against his ring. It felt too real to doubt. Still, he needed something more. Proof. Not for the world. For himself. The next morning, before Clara woke, he dug into his box of keepsakes and found what he was looking for. Emma's journal. In it, she'd sketched a crude family tree, but what caught his eye were the notes beneath the girl's birth entries. Clara has a small scar on her right shoulder. Lila has one on her knee. He remembered the accidents too. A fall on a lantern hook, a tumble off the porch step. When Clara came down for breakfast, he gently asked her to roll up her sleeve. The scar was there, a pale, crescent-shaped mark. His hands shook as he pointed to it. "Do you remember how you got that?" She looked, then touched it absently. "I used to ask her that, the woman who raised me. She said it was from before, that I was found that way." Thomas's voice broke. "Clara, I think you're my daughter." The silence between them thickened. Her eyes brimmed, but she didn't speak. Then she whispered, "What happened to Lila?" It was a question that had lived in his bones for 20 years, but now it hit with renewed force. If Clara had lived, maybe. "I don't know," he said. "I thought you both were gone, but if you lived, maybe she did too." They sat together in stillness, the storm outside rising. By afternoon, Thomas had hitched up the mule cart again. He needed answers. There was a name Clara remembered. The woman who raised her had once called herself Maybeth, but only when drunk, only in the middle of the night. Clara didn't know if it was her real name or a ghost she couldn't bury. Thomas searched the county records, dusty birth logs, census books, even obituaries. The name turned up only once. Maybeth Keller, died winter 3 years prior, buried in an unmarked grave near 3 Pines. He rode out there by lantern light. The town had no church, just a cemetery behind the shuttered post office. The caretaker said the woman was odd, kept to herself, came from the east during the flood years, said she'd always claimed the girl was her niece, but no one believed it. Thomas stood over the crude wooden marker. "You stole my daughter," he whispered, "but you didn't kill her." When he turned back toward the mule cart, he saw something in the snow, small footprints, too small to be Clara's. He followed them with growing dread and wonder. They led to the edge of the woods. There, sitting on a log, was a girl, younger, same dark hair, same face. She looked up and said, "Are you my father?" Thomas's knees nearly gave out. The girl on the log had Clara's eyes, the same deep-set hazel flecked with gold, but brighter, more alert. She wore a patchwork coat, too thin for the frost, and clutched a woolen scarf in her lap like it was all she had. Her boots didn't match. Her fingers were blue at the tips, and yet, somehow, she looked steady, like she had been waiting for this moment far longer than he had even dared to dream it could come. He took a cautious step forward, heart thundering in his chest. "What did you say?" The girl's voice wavered. "I asked if you were my father. I think... maybe I'm wrong. But Clara said you had kind eyes." Thomas swallowed. Hard. "Clara told you about me. She didn't know it was you. Not at first. She said she saw a man in her dreams, holding a wooden horse, crying over a crib. She said she used to think he was a ghost, but when she saw you sleeping by the fire, she said it was the same man." Thomas blinked back tears. That wooden horse was still on his nightstand, untouched for years. He hadn't told anyone about those nights, not even the neighbors who brought food after the river took his family. He'd sat by the crib, rocking a toy in silence until sleep finally took him. Emma had carved that horse herself. Lila used to call it Mr. Gallop. He looked at the girl again, her fingers tightening around the scarf. "What's your name?" "I don't know. I mean, the woman who raised me called me Lottie. But when I was sick once, really bad sick, I heard someone whispering to me. A voice like wind in a church. It said, 'Leela.' I thought maybe I made it up. But after that, whenever I looked at myself in the river, I'd whisper it, just to see if it fit." Thomas's throat tightened so hard he could hardly speak. "It fits," he said. "It's your name, Lila Halver." She blinked. "And you're my father?" "I am." She didn't run to him. She didn't cry. She just stared at him for a long moment before saying, "Where were you all this time?" "I thought you drowned," he said, voice breaking. "I thought I lost both of you. We searched for weeks. The sheriff found a baby's bonnet. He said no one could survive the flood. But I did," she said, same words Clara had spoken. "I woke up in a cabin. I was too little to understand. The woman said I was hers now. She had an old dog and a bad cough. We moved every winter. She taught me to keep quiet, keep moving. Sometimes she'd cry and whisper things about a fire. Sometimes she'd drink until she forgot I existed." Thomas knelt slowly in the snow, every bone aching, not from age but from years of grief that now threatened to flood free. "I never stopped loving you, not for a second." Lila looked down, then whispered, "I thought love was something you had to earn. She used to say I was lucky to be kept, that no one else wanted a burden." "You were never a burden," Thomas said, hand trembling as he reached forward. "You were my joy." And then, at last, she moved toward him, carefully, cautiously, as though afraid the moment would shatter if she moved too fast. She stepped into his arms, cold and stiff and small, and buried her face against his shoulder. He held her like he was holding a miracle. They stayed that way for a long time. By the time he brought her back to the homestead, dusk had fallen. The clouds were low and heavy, and the fireplace glow flickered through the frosted window panes. Clara sat in a rocking chair, wrapped in a blanket, hands cupped around a steaming mug. When the door opened, she looked up and froze. Lila stepped inside, brushing snow from her shoulders. For a moment, neither spoke, just stared. Clara slowly set her mug down. "It's you," she said. "I saw you once, in a dream. You were crying by a broken doll." "I remember that," Lila said, "and I thought I was the only one." The silence broke like glass. They rushed into each other's arms. Thomas turned away, his chest tight. 20 years of silence and loss, now broken by the sound of soft, shaky laughter between two souls who had been stitched together before they were born. That night, none of them slept. They sat by the fire telling stories. Half-remembered, mismatched, fragments of memories that made no sense but still warmed the room like another blanket. Clara remembered a red ribbon Lila used to hide in her shoes. Lila remembered Clara's snore. They both remembered the taste of Emma's cornbread, though neither had tasted it since they were toddlers. Thomas listened more than he spoke. Every time he blinked, he feared it would vanish, that he'd open his eyes and be alone again. But morning came and the girls were still there. They stayed close to the hearth the next few days. Thomas taught them how to feed the chickens, how to milk the stubborn cow, how to mend a fence with nothing but twine and grit. The snow thickened, and so did the bond between them. They laughed more, cried less. Clara began to sing while she worked, something soft and slow. Lila found a quilt Emma had started and began stitching it together, square by square. But the world doesn't stop spinning just because joy returns. 3 days after their reunion, Sheriff Bell came knocking. He wore his Sunday coat, boots scuffed from the road, and an odd look on his face. Thomas invited him in, heart already starting to beat a little faster. "I heard something strange," Bell said, after setting his hat down. "2 girls showed, up in 3 Pines a few days ago. One went to the store, bought a coat with buttons shaped like stars. The clerk said she asked about a man named Thomas Halver." Thomas nodded slowly. "She found me." "I see that," Bell said, glancing toward the kitchen where the girls were baking bread, flour in their hair. "That's the strange part. Both those girls. They matched the descriptions from 20 years ago. Right down to the scar on the shoulder." Thomas met his eyes. "They're mine." "I believe you," Bell said. "But that's not the only strange thing. I ran a check on the name they gave me, Maybeth Keller. She's not just a nobody. She was wanted in 3 states, took babies from flood victims, said she was rescuing them. But she kept them for herself, always moved just before anyone got too curious." Thomas's hands clenched, on the table. "She stole them." Bell nodded. "Looks that way. But here's what's troubling me. A man came through town yesterday, said he was Maybeth's cousin, claimed the girls were his nieces, said he's their rightful guardian now that she's dead." Thomas's stomach turned. "I don't think the law will side with him," Bell continued. "But he has papers, forged most likely, and he's loud, threatening to raise a legal storm. I won't let him take them." Bell raised a hand. "Neither will I. But you need to be ready. If this goes to court, they'll ask for proof, and 20 years is a long time to cover. I have lockets, scars, stories. You'll need more than that." That night, Thomas sat at the table with the girls and told them everything. What the sheriff had said, what might happen next. Clara looked frightened. Lila looked furious. "I'll never go with him," Lila said. "I'd run first. I'd vanish again." "No," Thomas said, firm. "No more running. If we fight this, we do it the right way. We find the truth. We bring it into the light." Clara spoke up. "The woman who raised us, she kept a box. A wooden one. She never let us touch it. But when she died, I saw her bury it. In the garden behind the cabin. Thomas leaned forward. Do you remember where? I think so, she said. If it's still there, it might have records, pictures, something. They made a plan. At first light, they would ride to the old cabin, try to dig it up before the snow swallowed it for good. But when Thomas stepped out onto the porch that night, he saw a rider approaching fast through the storm, lanterns swinging wildly. It was Belle. He jumped down before the mule cart even stopped. He's coming, he said. The cousin. He's got men with him, and he's not waiting for court. Thomas stared at the dark horizon, where storm and shadow blended together. He whispered, Then we don't have much time. They packed in under an hour, the morning barely a flicker of light on the horizon, when Thomas hitched the mule cart. Clara loaded blankets, bread, a tin of beans, and a pair of thick scarves into the back, while Lila wrapped the map she had drawn from memory in oilcloth. Sheriff Bell stood beside them, with his rifle slung over his shoulder, jaw tight, eyes never straying far from the northern ridge. They'll come from 3 Pines, he said. There's only one trail wide enough for horses and wagons. If you stay off the main road, you'll buy yourself a day. Thomas nodded. That might be all we need. Bell laid a hand on the cart's side rail. You bring back whatever you find, Halver. Don't get any ideas about disappearing. The law's still on your side for now. I'm not running, Thomas said. I'm digging. The trail through the southern pass was narrow and treacherous, a slithering cut through cliffs and frost-bitten trees. The mules struggled in the deeper drifts, and once the cart nearly tipped where a wheel caught a buried root. But Thomas kept going. Clara clung to Lila in the back, eyes wide as the landscape turned familiar again. Raw stretches of earth and pine, where she'd grown into silence. They reached the cabin ruins by midday. What had once stood as a squat cedar shack was now half swallowed by snow, the roof sunken in, walls warped and scorched where fire had licked the eaves. Clara's breath hitched when she saw it. She burned it after Lila left, she whispered. Said it was cursed. Thomas stared at the blackened boards. She knew she was about to be caught. She said bad things grew here, Clara added, but I think she was talking about herself. The garden was behind the cabin, a knuckled patch of land ringed by old stones and broken glass jars, now hidden beneath a foot of frozen soil. They took turns hacking at it with a spade. Thomas kept in the cart, sweat soaking through their shirts despite the cold. Lila dug harder than either of them, her jaw clenched tight, eyes sharp with fury. They hit wood just after sunset, a box, pine and rusted at the corners, its lid warped but still sealed. Thomas pried it open with the back of the shovel. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were papers. Dozens. Handwritten notes, photos, torn letters, and a journal, bound in cracked red leather. Thomas held his breath as he opened the cover. The first page read, Maybeth Keller, 1879. Confession. Should my sins be questioned in the next life? He flipped through quickly. Inside, dates and entries sprawled in wild, looping cursive. Mentions of Clara, of Lila, of the flood. I took them, one line read. 2 crying girls in a cradle of driftwood. The world wouldn't miss them. I needed company, and someone to carry the name. Thomas's hands trembled. Beneath that page was a sketch, crude but recognizable, a woman's face. Emma's. Scrawled below it, the mother. Dead, surely. Floating. He turned the next page. Another entry. One that chilled him deeper. The older girl remembers too much. Keeps saying, Mama, and pointing at me like I'm a lie. I slapped her once. She screamed her sister's name. Lila. I must break her of this if she's to be mine. Thomas stopped reading. Clara's face was pale. Lila sat stone still. We have enough, he said. We can prove everything. But just as he started to rewrap the bundle, Lila reached in and pulled out a faded photograph. It was the 3 of them, Lila, Clara, and Maybeth, standing on a porch. Lila couldn't have been more than 3. Her eyes were red from crying. Clara looked older, her face empty. She told everyone we were hers, Lila said. She made us wear those ugly dresses. Said it was how mothers dressed their daughters. She was never your mother, Thomas said. Not for 1 minute. Lila folded the photograph and tucked it into her coat. Let's go. But as they stepped back toward the cart, Thomas noticed something strange. Tracks. Fresh ones. Hoof prints. Several horses. Circling the trail. His blood froze. They're here, he said. They didn't wait to be found. Thomas lashed the mules hard, snapping the reins as the cart jerked forward. Snow kicked up in thick clouds behind them. Lila crouched low, her arms wrapped tight around the journal. Clara turned, watching the ridge. Within minutes, they heard it, the unmistakable crack of branches behind them. Hooves, yells, men were following. Thomas shouted over the wind. If they catch us, they'll take you. We can't let them. Then, we don't let them, Lila yelled. The trail narrowed ahead, squeezing between two tall stone outcrops. Thomas veered left, praying the mules wouldn't falter. He'd once used this path to bring firewood from the far valley. He knew where. It led. A frozen creek, a narrow bridge, and beyond that, the switchback down into Ridge Hollow. If they made it, Sheriff Bell would meet them. He'd promised to have a deputy there. Behind them, a gunshot rang out. A bullet tore through the canvas above their heads. Clara screamed and ducked. Thomas didn't turn around. Faster, he cried to the mules. Faster, old friends. Come, on! The animals surged forward, eyes wild. More gunshots. Then, sharp pain. A white-hot tear across Thomas's shoulder. He grunted, teeth clenched, but didn't drop the reins. We're almost there, he gasped. They burst through the final. Copse of trees, and saw it. The bridge. Narrow, old, lined with brittle planks, barely wide enough for the cart. Thomas didn't hesitate. They hit the bridge hard. The cart wheels bounced. The wood groaned. Beneath them, the creek churned black and cold. Behind, riders stopped short. The bridge wouldn't hold a horse. Thomas pulled hard, jerking the mules forward. They cleared it just as a shot hit the beam beside his head, splintering it into shards. Lila screamed. Clara ducked again. Then, snap! The bridge groaned once more and collapsed. The riders were trapped. Thomas didn't stop. He drove the cart into the hollow and straight toward Ridge Hill, where Bell's deputy waited with 2 men and a pair of rifles. They signaled at once. Thomas jerked the reins and slowed. We got what we came for, he told them. It's over. They made it back to town before dawn. Sheriff Bell stood on the steps of the courthouse, arms folded. When Thomas handed him the journal, the photos, and the letters, the man's face changed. He turned grim. This is everything, Bell said. It's enough, Thomas said. Lila and Clara stood beside him. The sky began to glow behind them, soft peach light rising over the snowy fields. The next week passed in a blur. The court convened, faster than anyone expected. The man claiming to be Maybeth's cousin, Gregory Keller, arrived in town with 3 lawyers and a stack of forged documents. But Bell had already wired the state marshals. They arrived with records from Maybeth's. Old warrants confirmed that the man was no blood relative, just a former accomplice who helped her disappear with the girls. When he realized the case had collapsed, he tried to run. Bell arrested him himself. In court, Thomas took the stand. He spoke little. Let the journal speak louder. Let Clara lift her sleeve to show the scar. Let Lila hold up her locket. Twist it open. Reveal the faded drawing of a horse that Emma had once tucked inside. When the judge spoke his ruling, his voice was quiet but clear. These girls belong with their father. It is not only proven, it is just. No one cheered. It was too sacred a moment. Thomas stood, took his daughter's hands, and walked them out of the courtroom into the cold morning sun. The town watched in silence. Then someone tipped their hat. Another clapped. By the time they reached the cart, half the town was following behind. No one said a word, but tears shimmered in the eyes of men and women who'd lived through floods, fires, and long winters. They knew grief. They knew what it looked like when it was lifted. The girls were home, and the town cried. The house felt different now. Not just because it was full again, though the soft creak of floorboards above, the warm rattle of Clara's humming in the kitchen, the rhythmic scratch of Lila sketching by the window filled the once hollow rooms with life. But because it no longer echoed with what had been lost, it breathed, it exhaled. And though the snow still coated the ground and the cold still crept in beneath the window panes, something inside had thawed. Thomas tried to adjust, but he was a man built by silence. For 20 years, it had been his shield, his weight, his penance. The girls changed that in ways he hadn't expected. He found himself waking early not from nightmares, but from the smell of cornbread or the sound of laughter downstairs. Clara had taken to cooking as if it grounded her. Lila, though slower to smile, had begun stacking papers by the window, pages filled with drawings of things Thomas had long forgotten. Birds, bridges, apples, their porch, a wagon wheel, scenes from the past, scenes from her memory. He kept the journal locked in a chest in the attic, next to Emma's shawl and the final photograph they'd ever taken together. Her holding the twins on the porch, the river behind them. All three, smiling. He couldn't bear to look at it often, but now and then, when the fire burned low, he'd climb the ladder and sit with it a while. One morning, about 3 weeks after the trial, a letter arrived, sealed in a plain envelope with no return address. Thomas opened it at the kitchen table, Lila across from him sketching quietly. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharper, precise. To Mr. Halver, it began. There are truths buried deeper than even you have yet dug. Maybeth kept secrets, yes, but she wasn't the only one. If you want the full story, come to the old rail yard north of Bingham's Pass. Midnight. Bring no law. If you bring the girls, come alone. It was unsigned. Thomas read it twice, then folded it slowly. Lila was watching him. Another threat? She asked. No, he said after a moment. A hook. He didn't tell Clara about the letter. Not at first. She was still fragile in certain ways. Though she was no longer frightened in the same way she had been in Maybeth's home, she startled, easily, recoiled from loud noises, and refused to sleep unless the door was bolted and a candle flickered at her bedside. Lila had taken to sleeping on the floor beside her bed, without being asked. Thomas let the day pass uneventfully. They chopped firewood. Lila read an old Bible she'd found in the attic. Clara helped sew a new patch into one of the quilts. But when midnight drew near, Thomas slipped on his coat and tucked the letter into his breast pocket. He almost made it to the barn before Lila stepped into the path behind him. I'm coming, she said. No, you're not. You need me. I need you to be safe. She crossed her arms, jaw set. If this is about us, then I have a right to hear it. I won't argue, Thomas said. You're staying here. She stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. But as he reached the mule, saddling it quietly under a half-moon sky, he saw her shadow flit behind the far fence. He knew she wouldn't stay. He rode north alone, or so he let himself believe. The trail wound past the creek, through thin woods, and along the broken railway that once fed the mill town of Bingham's Pass. The old yard had been abandoned since the flood, the tracks half swallowed by dirt, the depot collapsed, metal scattered like bones across the snow. It was a place of ghosts. He saw the lantern first, hung from a post beside a rusted switch engine. A figure stood beneath it, hooded. Thomas dismounted and approached slowly. You sent the letter, he said. The figure nodded. A woman, her voice low, dry. You weren't the only one Maybeth wronged. Thomas stepped closer. Who are you? The woman pulled back her hood. She looked to be in her late 30s, maybe early 40s. Pale skin, sunken cheeks, dark eyes. There was something vaguely familiar about her face, but he couldn't place it. "I was taken too," she said. "Long before your girls, I escaped. Others didn't." Thomas felt his heart thud. She did this before. She took children, ones who wouldn't be missed, runaways, half-orphans, sold some, kept others, lied to them, broke them, made them call her mother. The woman stepped closer, her breath misting in the cold air. She had help. A man. The one who came for your daughters. Keller. Thomas's eyes narrowed. He's in jail. Not for long. He has money. People on the outside. Thomas shook his head. "We proved everything. You proved just enough, but not everything. And he knows it." He didn't speak. Snow fell quietly around them, a hush between the brittle branches. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. The woman reached into her coat and pulled out a bundle of folded papers. Proof. Names. Places. Letters. She wrote it all down, like a ledger. It was never about family, it was a business. Thomas took the papers, flipped through them quickly. Names, ages, tallies, most of them marked with a small cross. He swallowed hard. "Where did you get these?" "I went back," she said. "After the fire. After she ran." He looked at her again, trying to place the face. "You're not in town. I'd remember." "I keep moving," she said. "Some wounds don't heal just because you find the truth. Some stay open." Thomas understood that too well. "Why now?" "Because your girls matter. Because someone like her doesn't get to win by dying in a fire or disappearing in court. If Keller walks free, he'll come back. Not for them. For something worse." Thomas stared at the papers. Then he heard the crunch. Snow behind him. He turned. Lila. Her eyes were wide. Not from fear, but recognition. She was staring at the woman. "You," she said. "You were in the garden. The night. I ran. I saw you." The woman went still. "I remember your necklace," Lila said. "A cross. You gave me a piece of bread." The woman looked away. "I didn't know what to do." "You helped me," Lila said. "I didn't help enough." Thomas stepped between them. "We need to leave. All of us." "No," the woman said. "I'm not going back. You'll be safer. I'm not afraid of them. I'm afraid of staying still." Thomas took a breath, nodded. "Then I'll take the papers. I'll use them. I'll make sure this doesn't come back." The woman nodded, backed away into the trees, and vanished before either of them could say another word. They rode back silently. Thomas kept the papers clutched tight. Lila didn't cry. But when they reached the house and crept inside, she didn't. "Go upstairs." She followed him to the kitchen, sat beside him at the table, and waited as he spread out the pages. Clara came down an hour later, said nothing, just joined them, and together, in the candlelight, they began sorting through a story darker and deeper than they had imagined. The next morning, Thomas rode to the courthouse. Sheriff Bell was waiting. He looked at the new papers, then at Thomas. "I'll Sandy. For the marshals again," Bell said. "This time they won't miss." Thomas nodded. "We have to make sure no one else ends up like her." Bell folded the papers. "We will." By the week's end, Keller was moved to federal custody. He wouldn't see light again. And across the region, a slow reckoning began. Families came forward. Stories surfaced. One by one, those who had suffered in silence found voice. The Halver farm became something more than a homestead. It became a place where stories were told, where silence was broken, where healing began. The snow melted late that year. The spring came slow, and when it finally did, it arrived not in a flourish, but as a quiet surrender. Icicles dripping like tears from the eaves, the sound of thawed creek water moving beneath thin ice, and little green blades pushing stubbornly through dirt that had known only frost. And on the Halver farm, something else took root, something more stubborn than winter, something long buried but now reaching toward light. Clara had taken to mornings. She would wake before the sun and sit on the porch wrapped in Emma's old shawl, her feet tucked beneath her as she watched the fields for signs of deer or foxes, or simply for the quiet comfort of routine. Thomas would wake not long after, always pretending he hadn't heard her slip down the stairs. He'd bring her tea, then sit beside her in silence until Lila appeared with her sketch pad and sometimes a drawing already half done of the trees, of the porch, of her sister still sleeping upstairs with a small wooden cross beneath her pillow. The days were simple now, not easy, not free from memory or sudden grief, but simple in the way a river is after the flood has passed. The structure was still fragile, but it held, and they moved through it together. People came. At first, it was a trickle, strangers who had read about the case in a paper, or had heard from a cousin or a friend that there was a man in the valley who'd once lost everything and somehow found it again. Some came with stories, others with wounds they hadn't yet spoken aloud. Thomas didn't always know what to say, but Clara often did. She would listen, nod, and offer something warm to hold. Lila never said much, but she began drawing portraits, gently, silently, of the people who passed through. The sheriff came by more often too. Bell had aged 10 years in one winter, but there was a renewed fire in him now. He'd organized a sweeping investigation across the region based on the woman's papers, and with Thomas's help, had traced names, letters, symbols. At least 4 families had been reunited, though many more stories ended with crosses on paper. Still, it mattered. Maybeth's body was never found. The fire had destroyed more than just her home. It had erased her footprints from the earth, or so it seemed. But her absence didn't erase the harm she'd done. That stayed, and so too did the choice to rise from it. One Sunday morning, as the church bell rang faintly from the town 3 miles off, Thomas stood in the barn doorway and watched as Clara tried to teach a goat how to walk on a lead. The goat refused. Clara laughed. Lila sketched the whole scene. He hadn't laughed like that in decades. Not since before the river. Not since Emma. He looked down at his hands. They were still scarred, still rough, still the hands of a man who had known hard soil and harder grief. But they no longer shook. They no longer reached for a bottle in the night. Inside, on the mantel, there was a new photograph. Taken 2 weeks prior by a man who'd stopped on his way west, a travelling photographer with a long coat and a soft voice. He'd offered to take it for free, said the story had changed his life. In the photo, Thomas stood between Clara and Lila. The girls weren't smiling, not in the way children smile for candies or play. They were smiling like they knew what it cost to stand there at all. Clara's hand was on his shoulder, Lila's drawing pad tucked beneath her arm. They had come full circle. That night, Thomas sat with his Bible open. It was Emma's, the pages worn soft from her hands. He wasn't a preacher. He didn't claim to understand everything in those pages. But as the fire crackled low and the wind pressed gently against the window pane, he read aloud, not for himself, but for the home. He healeth the broken in heart and bindeth up their wounds. The next morning brought a letter, not a warning this time. A folded parchment sealed with a pressed flower. He opened it carefully. To Thomas Halver and family, it began. I've found a place. It's not much, a church with a broken roof, and 3 pews that don't sit straight, but there's space for stories, for others like us. I'll call it the Quiet House. I'll keep a candle lit in the window. If you ever need to find me, you will. It was signed only, yours in truth, M. Clara found him reading it on the porch. From her, she asked softly. He nodded. She was brave. So were you, he said. She leaned against him. Do you think she'll be okay? I think she already is. In the weeks that followed, Thomas began writing. Nothing grand, just scraps at first. Memories, names. He wanted a record, not just of what had happened, but of what it had taken to rise afterward. Lila helped. She illustrated the pages. Clara corrected his grammar with a grin. They bound it with twine and left it by the front door for anyone who passed through. The Halver place became more than a farm. It became a refuge, a place for the ones who had no names in the paper, the ones who survived without headlines. The ones who needed to sit on a porch, sip tea, and speak aloud what they'd only whispered in prayer. And sometimes, when the nights were still and the fire burned low, Thomas would climb into the attic, not because the past called to him, but because it reminded him of what it meant to walk forward. He'd run his fingers across Emma's shawl, glance at the photograph, then open the chest and lift the journal one more time. But now, instead of grief, he read it as a ledger of survival, of returning, of grace. And each time he closed it, he whispered, not goodbye, but thank you. One morning, in early summer, the twins led him to the edge of the field. They'd cleared a small patch near the trees, smoothed the ground, planted wildflowers. What's this? He asked. Clara reached into her pocket, pulled out a small wooden marker. On it, burned carefully with Lila's carving tool, were 3 names: Emma Halver, Mabel Halver, Mary Halver. He looked at the girls. We thought, Clara said quietly, they deserved a place too. He knelt, ran his hand across the names, then stood and hugged them both. The past would never leave. But now it had a place, a home, and it no longer had the power to steal the future. As the sun rose, Thomas Halver, once broken, once alone, stood between his daughters, eyes full, hands steady, and breathed in the dawn of a life that had waited 20 years to begin again.